Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 7 Practical Virtual Sales Practices to Use Now and Continue Later, How Current Circumstances Change Sales for Good and for the Better. My name is Jeremy Hess, Digital Marketing Manager at CloudShare, and before we get started, let's just go through a few housekeeping notes. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with everyone in the coming days. We will have a couple of polls and some other chat interaction, so be ready for that. And feel free, of course, to ask questions in the live chat at any point. And if you want to check out any of our previous webinars, you can go ahead to that link. And today our speakers are Ray Wang, Founder and Principal Analyst at Constellation Research, Nicole France, VP and Principal Analyst at Constellation Research, and Dr. Tzvi Guterman, CEO and Co-Founder at CloudShare. And before we get started with the next slides, Ray and Nicole and Tzvi, one after the other, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves? Go ahead, Ray.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jeremy. I'm Ray Wang. Nice to meet everybody. I'm looking at the future, what's changing the digital world, and of course, what do we do in this post-pandemic recovery? So, nice meeting everyone.
Great, Nicole.
I'm Nicole France. I get to work with Ray at Constellation. My patch is a very broad view of customer experience. The idea that actually customer experience isn't really relegated to customer service and support. It's something everybody in the business is responsible for doing. So I look across marketing, sales, service, and a few other things just to keep the grab bag of fun interesting. How companies are really working to make that whole set of experiences not only good, but consistently good. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of the benefits of the work we've been doing on that subject today.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And Tzvi.
Hi everyone, I'm Tzvi Guterman. I'm the founder and CEO of CloudShare. Nicole and Ray, excited to be here with you today and looking forward for an interesting dialogue. For me, this is besides again, of course, the global challenge and the pandemic, this period brings a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. And I think we're going to discuss some of these capabilities today and how we learn and see other organizations actually mitigate, act in an innovative way to do better in such challenging time.
Great, fantastic. Okay, thanks everybody. And as we move on, we see the agenda where we will talk about those 7 sales practices we were mentioning earlier. We'll talk about accelerating your business through various technologies, including cloud-based demos and POCs, and the old versus new sales toolkit, which is a very interesting side-by-side comparison. So moving on from there, we will go straight into our first poll. And that poll question is, what is your role in your organization? And if you'll hold on for me just 1 second, assuming there are no technical difficulties, I'll do my best to bring up. Looks like I might have a technical difficulty, so I'm gonna have to actually roll out of here and pull up the poll question. So if everyone goes ahead and looks at their screens, we'll go ahead and launch this poll. So we have C-level, VP, sales manager, sales executive, sales engineering manager, and sales engineer. And while we wait just a couple of minutes, or actually a couple of seconds, Ray, what do you think might be the mix here that we might see? What would you be interested in seeing?
So you know what, I am interested in seeing like as many of the different roles here that are listed. Part of the reason is because it's the interaction between the roles that are really going to help us get out of this pandemic, and really the interactions is really where we're going to see how we communicate and move forward as a team. So to me, it'll be interesting to see the spread, but we'll find out who the real decision makers are based on who's on this call. So pretty soon, I'm sure.
We just might.
What are you expecting?
So I'll go. Oh yeah. Honestly, I mean, it just depends on sort of, who thought this was, right for them to that this was the right type of information for them to hear and the right topic. So actually, I'll go ahead and end the poll and we'll actually see that it is quite a mix. So if everyone looks at their screens, you'll see that we actually have sales engineers at the top. So that's pretty interesting. But Ray, as you suggested, or as you almost guessed, basically, it was a mix. So it's very interesting to see what we have. And so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and stop sharing this poll now, and we'll go ahead and continue on, and thank everybody for sharing in that poll. And while we get ready here, Ray, why don't you go ahead and take us into the post-pandemic playbook? Yeah.
So over the last 10 weeks, a lot of us have been trying to figure out where our businesses were headed, what was happening, what was new, how we're going to be successful. And I think we've learned a lot about ourselves. We learned about our selling motions. We learned about how our businesses operate. We know what our dependencies are. And during that process, we came up talking to about 400 CXOs throughout the last 10 weeks, thinking about what the important things were in this post-pandemic playbook. And we realized that we had to get back to first principles. Who are our people? What are the processes? How do they interact? And that became a very important part. The second part was thinking about, what is the business model and the economics behind it, right? How does our business model fit within the economy? So you saw that, very easy example in the consumer world, restaurants, right? You're operating for maximum revenue per square feet. Yeah, that model's probably going to go over. We're going to try a different approach. Instead of putting more butts into seats and squeezing the tables, we're going to have to try different opportunities, which include takeout, pick up online, curbside, all that kind of stuff. The third thing that we realized was also the impact of technology on our businesses, helping us collaborate, helping us think through, where we can actually automate, where we can actually make better decisions more quickly, where we can actually collaborate in a different way. And that came as we started doing work from home and remote work. And then the last piece was really how politics and legislation really have an impact on our business. And then as we were thinking about that, all under the context of where public health and economic health come together. And that was really the foundation of the anchors on this post-pandemic playbook. Everybody on our team had built out a pandemic playbook or has been talking about it in their area, and that's what we wanted to share. Now, when we go to the next slide, we'll drill in deeper in terms of some of those areas around people and process, and of course, technology and the business models. And as we noticed on the people and process side, the way we lead, the way we run sales teams, the way we run our leadership organizations change, right? There used to be that management by walking around, like listening in, checking in on the water cooler, getting yourself attuned to what was going on, understanding the deals. Well, as you know, that's gone away. It's a little bit different now, especially when we're doing remote and people working from home. But also there are a lot of things that actually popped up, right? Trust becomes even more important than ever. If you have an established relationship, that trust is the currency as we go forward. People are valuing that trust. People are counting on that trust. And of course, a lot of us have worked from home. But another piece that's been important is we've lost the 1 hour, 2 hour commute, the dead time that we're sitting around mindlessly trying to get from point A to point B. And we have some opportunities to look at reskilling and retraining, really to gain new skill sets. And we'll hear more about that later. And then, of course, the way we kind of communicate, the way we get information from others, the way we crowdsource, put people together, that's also important. We're checking out gig economy capacity. We're thinking about how to ramp up effectively. And then, of course, we can't forget about each of our employees' health and safety, thinking about mental health, making sure people are feeling okay, and also feeling safe and being safe, right? Especially when we'll talk about it on the cyber side, especially with the security attacks and the phishing attacks. But on the technology side, what we discovered is we do want a level of continuity and planning. We do want to get to some level of agility and resiliency. That means getting into the cloud. That means being able to have those options available. That means digitizing channels. That means, not looking at that dashboard once a week, but starting the day with analytics and starting the day with those decisions. That's also thinking about where we can automate and self-service, right? Areas that have human contact that might not need human contact are being automated as we speak from a safety perspective. And then, of course, all those attacks, DDoS attacks, phishing attacks, up 1,000% in cybersecurity. And how do we actually work around that? And then, of course, our privacy, and of course, digital acceleration and remote employee kits. Now, when we look at the next set of items on the next slide, what we'll see is the business model economy. We're seeing also a shift to a lot of M&A that's going to occur. A lot of companies may not make it. And so it's really a question of understanding post-merger integration, being prepared for mergers and acquisitions. It's also thinking about what happens in the consolidated market when this occurs. And then, of course, you got to have different types of business models. Subscription business models pop up. And then we've got other things that are designed around international relations and foreign affairs. The last piece, politics and legislative, have a piece here. And while most of us and the populace actually have a declining trust in institutions, there's an increasing trust in companies and companies whose brands reflect that. Also, we're also seeing supply chains change in terms of the concentration of supply chains. And then, of course, this conversation on privacy versus public health. But the main thing here to really think about is you need a post-pandemic playbook. You need to think about what you need to do going forward. And I think you'll find that from talking to our other speakers as well that are coming up. You're going to hear more about how they're going to get towards that. And more importantly, what tools will help you be successful and what's the right culture to be there. So thanks a lot, Jeremy.
Perfect. Thanks, Ray. And we'll just leave this slide here for just a minute and see if anybody had anything to ask on these post-pandemic playbook slides. And maybe if any of our other panelists had a question or two for you on these. So anybody have questions out there? We'll just wait a minute here.
While you're waiting for questions, Jeremy, I think one of the biggest things we keep hearing and people keep asking is, what can I do now today to help? And I think a lot of it is really around having the conversations, having the communications, keeping people updated, making sure people are feeling okay, checking with people on a regular basis. I think focusing on the people aspect first is really important to make sure everyone will be able to move forward.
Sure. All right, great. Thanks, Ray, so much. And now we are going to go ahead and move into Nicole's slides. And so, Nicole, why don't you take it away, and then we'll get into the poll question on the next slide.
Sure. Well, just picking up on Ray's last point there, and the fact that we're in this really strange and unusual set of circumstances here. But what's really critical, I think, is to understand we've moved past dealing with crisis and addressing what might have been a really temporary situation. And we can talk about post-pandemic, but the reality is we still have quite some distance to go before this thing is over. And what seems certain is what things look like after the pandemic is not going to be what they look like before it. And we've got this really interesting in-between time to navigate along the way. And I think what we'll talk about today is both what is relevant to the here and now, but also how these things are going to influence and shape the way we work once we are past the pandemic, and some of the things that we consider normal come back again, but also how that isn't going to be exactly what we might have expected or planned on previously before this whole situation arose. And I think a lot of that is really summed up in this whole message that I'm sure all of us have gotten from companies that we even forgot that we had ever purchased anything from. Anybody gotten a bunch of emails saying, hey, we're all in this together? I know I have. And in a lot of cases, I hadn't even realized that I'd ever had a transaction with that organization. So it raises some really interesting questions, because I think under any circumstances, selling successfully really comes down to building a sort of team relationship with your customer and working together to help meet their goals and objectives, right? I think any sort of sales methodology has some element that's addressing that kind of priority. And it actually, in a lot of ways, is considerably more difficult right now, not least because if you aren't careful, it's all too easy to come across as disingenuous or insincere, right? And it's a shame, because if we think about this really consciously, there's a huge opportunity here. Because what happens in the sales process, the kinds of interactions, the kinds of communications, the way expectations are set and followed through on, all of these factors really are very significant in terms of shaping how customers experience you as a business, right? And they set those expectations for what it's going to be like to be a customer, even if they haven't necessarily bought anything from you yet. So there's a huge amount of getting this selling process right and really understanding how to form that relationship with your customers at the very earliest stages that not only helps to increase your chances of making a sale, but also can form a really critical part of building those long-term, durable customer relationships that underpin a successful business. I'm curious, and I know, Jeremy, we've got a poll. It's a lot easier to do this when you can meet face-to-face with customers. But I think the really interesting question is, for those of you on now listening, what is your experience? What do you assign as the importance or value to face-to-face relationships and selling software? Is this something that's part of what you do all the time? Do you think it's a nice added benefit, but not necessary? What's your take? I'm really curious to see the answers. I know one of the things that we see very commonly, especially in software sales, is a kind of relationship between inside sales organizations that typically don't get to meet face-to-face with customers and account managers or outside sales teams. Sometimes they're large account sales teams that spend a lot of time building those face-to-face relationships. So I'm really curious to get a sense of what the mix is for the folks here on this call right now.
Yeah, well,
I'll
Jeremy, go ahead and share them then, Nicole. Yeah, let's see what the results are together. And we see, look at that. So,
Yeah.
71%, very important. And, I think we kind of expected that, based
Absolutely.
on what we've been doing for the past X many years, selling software. And so for the interesting 29% that said somewhat important, I'm interested to hear, do you have something else that you would use now? Do you feel that maybe Zoom is an actual, real way to sell? Maybe it's going to get better. Who knows, right? So we'd love to hear from you in the chat. If anyone who answered that it's somewhat important, to say what else could be, maybe something that could take the place of face-to-face sales.
Well, and we're certainly going to talk more about that too. So let's pick up with the first of these 7 sales practices that I think really are becoming more and more critical right now because of the current situation we find ourselves in, but are actually reshaping a lot of the basic fundamentals of how sales will continue to evolve going forward once we're on the other side. And the first thing is actually pretty simple and straightforward. And anybody who's been in sales for a while will probably chuckle a little bit at this one, but it's do your research, right? Understand what really matters to your customers. What are their big priorities and what is their sense of urgency? This is really more important now than ever, not least because those things have probably changed. It's been very interesting in the conversations that we have with a wide range of different business decision makers. What's really become evident is that the list of things that they had at the start of the year, they might have had a whole bunch of projects or initiatives that they were thinking about doing. They might have had more on their priority list than they knew they could get to. But one of the things that is absolutely certain is that as a result of the pandemic, their priorities have come into really sharp focus. So a lot of things have completely dropped off the list. Other things that might have been considered nice to have beforehand are now suddenly business critical, right? These things are essential. And it's interesting because that pattern seems to be equally true whether you're talking about a company that is dealing with a significant drop in demand and they really need to tackle the challenges of how to maintain their business operations and try to resuscitate growth and keep going. Or frankly, a whole lot of companies that have found themselves with, an unanticipated spike in demand who have to deal with a big increase in requirements. They've got more customer demand than they were necessarily anticipating they would be able or need to fill. And so they've got to deal with a very different set of issues and challenges, frankly, very quickly as well, right? So just to give you some examples in the areas that I look at, there's been a really big increase in demand for things like commerce capabilities, visual configurators and configure price quote tools, because you can't necessarily see it in real life or in a store. You want to be able to at least see it and manipulate it and see what your options are online, right? So these things are becoming very important. So are areas around customer support, customer service, right? These things are becoming really business critical because companies recognize that they need to focus on keeping the customers they have. They need to respond to whatever opportunities there are for growth and to win new customers. And they want to make sure that they are building the kinds of relationships that they can deliver on successfully. So there's a really interesting set of issues here that you can probably understand pretty quickly if you devote some time to and some background research on what's going on with your customer organization. It's a little bit harder because you don't necessarily have this sort of informal before the meeting small talk that would allow you to assess that if you were going to have a meeting in person. So I think what that means is there's much more onus on salespeople to actually put some of the effort in to understand, at least contextually, what's going on with that business. What does this person in this specific role have most likely on their plate that is driving their interest in what we're doing? And the other key thing is here, the sense of urgency, right? That's one of the big things that I think has changed. In a lot of cases, what we see is demand coming in now is for speed and rapid decision-making in a way that wouldn't have necessarily been true 3 or 4 months ago. All right, let's see here. I know we've got a question in Q&A here. It doesn't look like it's an actual question, but we'll see if we can address that. So the second thing, beyond doing your research and really trying to understand your customers' priorities, and by the way, the other side note there is ask good questions. If you at least have enough context to ask the right questions, you are well on your way to demonstrating to your customer, even if you haven't had the advantage of meeting them in person, that you get where they're coming from and that you understand their needs. Redirecting resources is something that I think we're all looking at now, right? So what are the things that we used to spend money on that we don't really have an opportunity to use anymore? And how can we put those investments to use in other tools and through other means that are going to help us get there? Let's face it, trade shows and expense account are not getting you very far at this point, right? And I think the advantage is that a lot of that, you know, whether it's travel and expense budget or sponsorship budgets for things that aren't happening, now can be reallocated to other things. The name of the game is really trying to figure out what the tools and the techniques are. What are the things that are worth spending money on that are going to help you to build the kind of closeness and relationship that you might otherwise have had just from getting to chat with somebody over the showroom floor, for example, at the sponsorship stand, or, you know, catching someone over a coffee, the ways that we really can't do anymore. And I know, Zvi, you guys have talked to a lot of customers who really have been focusing on how they can reallocate some of their resources and investments that they might have made and some of the stuff before, right?
Sure, yes. I can say that, I can share that actually as a vendor, about 25 to 30% actually of our incoming leads now are just from people with allocated budget that was for travel, and they really fast deploying it into doing more demos and POC. So that's on one hand as a vendor for CloudShare. The other part I should mention, and of course very in correlation to what you mentioned earlier, is that we see these organizations that, and again, also I think in a good correlation with our poll, that shifted from the fact that the majority of the relationship was the big thing in the process, right? As sales executives, we want to meet in person if we are able. We move the stages according to the relationship that what we got from the prospect, and we definitely see this transfer where technology and processes, as you mentioned, are actually able to allow people to compensate a bit, right? Because we are unable to meet in person. And I think the good news, and again, being optimistic and definitely on during this webinar, is that we actually have a lot of capabilities today. And if it's, I think that's a wonderful situation to be. Again, CloudShare and others, there's wonderful technology that can support you in doing these things.
I think we're all finding that. So let's move on to the next point here, number 3, because now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty here. What are some of the tools and techniques? What are some of the ways of thinking about this that are really going to help you to build those connections that would have been, you know, frankly, totally intuitive to the point where you didn't necessarily even have to think about how you were doing it when you had the option to meet someone in person, right? So what can you do now? Well, I think there are a variety of different tools and techniques. One certainly is using social media effectively. And I've got this great example that I absolutely love. This happens to be in a business to consumer kind of space, but it shows you the power of what you can do when you are really careful and thoughtful about using these tools. So a friend of mine, Matthew Halliday, who is a co-founder of Incorda, loves coffee. This is the subject of much discussion in real life and on Twitter. Right. So he happened to tweet out that he was missing the fact that he normally went out to get coffee, and he was thinking of buying an espresso machine. Well, it turns out that there's a company called Whole Lotta Love that specializes only in helping consumers to buy good espresso machines. And so he got this tweet, in fact, from the corporate handle. Now, what you have to understand about Matthew is he's also a huge K-pop fan. So for those of you unfamiliar with BTS, this is one of the band members obviously enjoying a cappuccino. So for Matthew, this was not only hugely entertaining, but a great introduction to this company that he had no knowledge of before they tweeted him, telling him that they could help him find the espresso machine that would work for him. It doesn't hurt that another mutual friend of ours on Twitter replied back and said, oh yeah, I've bought from those guys before, they're great, right? That's the kind of unsolicited word of mouth recommendation that is absolutely priceless and you can't buy, right? Well, to summarize the story, it took a few weeks, but Matthew finally ended up buying an espresso machine from Whole Lotta Love. So it was very, very effective in terms of connecting with Matthew. And part of the reason that it worked is because whoever was operating the corporate handle really took the time to not only see Matthew's explicit interest in this espresso machine, but to spend some time looking at what he was tweeting about, what he was evidently interested in, and frankly, getting to know him based on the information that he had provided. Now, I'm not suggesting that everything in building relationships is down to understanding personal details of your customers. Obviously, that's helpful. But my point is, in this exchange, this company did a very good job of understanding his demand signals, interpreting them, and finding a really good way of communicating and engaging with him, even though they have never met in person, have never spoken. And in fact, we're actually getting a tweet here from a corporate handle and not even from an individual. So there's tremendous power in these things. They can be used incredibly effectively. It's also very, very easy to get this wrong. And I know there's a group of us in the CRM space who have a little thing going called Protect the Identity, Not the Stupidity. So we're actively collecting all of the horrible solicitation notes that we all get through social media that are not good examples like this one is. So be careful, but be thoughtful, because you can use this stuff effectively. It's not just social media, right? And I think part of this is about how you build a tangible connection with someone. In the old days, as in like January and February, we might have gone out to dinner with a client, right? And shared a good conversation that probably wasn't solely about work over a meal and maybe a nice bottle of wine. You can't do that now, but there's nothing to prevent you from sending that nice bottle of wine and using that as a prompt for a conversation, whether you're both drinking a glass at the same time or not, right? One of the other things that we get a lot as industry analysts, and that I think also can be a very effective way of connecting with someone who you might have trouble getting through to or who you don't really know, is sending them something thoughtful. There's a lot of really good vendor swag out there that is actually really well received. And, you know, I've gotten all kinds of good things from some of the companies that would have provided it to us had we shown up at the big analyst conferences that we're normally flying around to. The kind of stuff that frankly we complain about having to put into our carry-on luggage when we get home, but it showed up at my house. You know, whether it's good coffee or some nice chocolate or, you know, a nice insulated coffee mug or something to support my new requirements for work at home desk accessories. You know, all of this stuff is actually a really effective way of getting someone's attention. There's another even more simple approach, and that's just writing a handwritten note. So we used to joke about this in my days in marketing, you know, the high impact mailer. This is really about thoughtful things that provide some tangible connection between you and your customer. All right, let's move on to number 4, because I think 3 is really all about how you make that initial connection, especially if you're dealing with someone you haven't already met in person. But where the rubber really meets the road is in building trust. And that is hard to do. It is especially hard to do when you don't have the opportunity to sit in the same room. I mean, there's a reason why, like this one, all of the images that are so cheesy around team building involve groups of people. And that's because the psychology research demonstrates time and time again that trust is way easier to build when you can do it face to face. Okay, not an option. So what are the options here? Well, there's a concept called swift trust. And this is another area of psychology research that is really pertinent to what we're trying to do and what I think we all face today. That is, how do you build trust quickly in virtual teams, right? So the concept of swift trust is really one that says you start out with a position of trusting the people that you're working with. And I think this is true whether we're talking about internal teams or whether we're talking about teaming with our customers to help meet their goals. What happens then is that you need to create some norms and you need to establish expectations that you follow through on that help to reinforce and confirm that that trust is well-founded. And ultimately, it really comes down to communication. So consistency, reliability, transparency, and also really integrity. If you want to think of it as integrity or sincerity, it's about meaning what you say, and it's about being very clear on that. You can still have a sense of humor when you do it, but it's really about understanding that what expectations you set for your customer, they can rely on the fact that you're going to follow through on that. And you're going to keep them informed with their needs and priorities and their objectives in mind. And I know, Svi, you know, at our companies both have a lot of experience in dealing with this stuff. I know Constellation, we all are virtual and were before the pandemic, but you guys at CloudShare are pretty virtual as well because you're spread all over the world.
Right, we are. We have people working in all different time zones and different cultures as well. I'll echo that. I think we witnessed that when we are the customer, and of course when we sell and when we interact with people. I think again, looking at the positive side of things right now, many times, because of the situation, because of the crisis in general, and specific for COVID-19, people actually take decisions faster, and we witness that as well. Definitely, again, what we see in CloudShare is that people are coming. I need a solution. Like again, I'm dealing now with priorities 1 to 3. I need a solution this month. And I'm replacing something, again, this travel, this meeting in person. Can demos work for me? Can you show me? And I think what we definitely try, and I'll encourage others, this, as you started with these generic emails of we're all in that together. Yes, but hey, let's focus. Let's be consistent. Be respectful for the other side, right? If you just blast me with nonsense, I'll be more aggressive during this period. But on the other way, if you're able to clearly say your message, right? We allow you to do, again, like with CloudShare, we do 3x more demos in 1/5 of the cost, right? So the total cost of ownership. We're trying to be very direct and bring the value, and I think this is relevant for all of us as an industry, and what I recommend to others to act.
Well, you know, it's interesting, and Vijay asked a couple of questions here, one of which I'll address at the end of this, but one of which is about, you know, with sales largely going digital, will buying behavior change? I think the answer is yes, and part of that is what you just articulated, Zvi. The demand now is for speed. Now, I need this, I need it now, and I need it to work reliably. So really condensing and accelerating that sales process is absolutely something that we see happening now that I think there is every reason to expect will continue once we're past the pandemic, because people get used to a different cadence of operating, and it's hard to go back, right? Once you get a taste for speed, it's hard to slow back down. And on that note, Jeremy, let's go to number 5, because I think this is a nice segue here as well. This is really about cutting to the chase. And as you said, Zvi, this is really about showing people rather than telling them. And I think particularly when it comes to software, good products that are well positioned and well presented really speak for themselves. So letting your potential customers see what you have to offer, doing something that's tailored to their particular circumstances and requirements is a really powerful way of helping to make the case. And I think particularly with demos, being able to do something that allows you on the fly to make changes and adapt to questions that come up during the course of conversation, things that you might have anticipated before the demo, but maybe you didn't, you know, being able to adapt on the fly and show customers what really matters most to them is far more powerful than telling them how great it is. And it's one of those things that I think we've already seen has been a critical part of selling software, but that has certainly increased very substantially, both because there is such a demand to get to the right solution quickly, and also because, you know, I think honestly, we don't have the luxury of some of the small talk and some of the other things that are, you know, relationship building, but also time consuming around the sales process. So I think cutting right to the chase here has really dual benefits. And if we move to number 6, we can really take it a bit further too, because it's not just giving them a taste of what it looks like, it's really letting them discover for themselves. And that's where live proofs of concept that are, again, tailored and adapted and can be stood up quickly to help customers envision what this can do for them just helps to seal the deal that much further. And, you know, I think that what we see is if you get to the proof of concept stage, you've got a much higher likelihood of closing deals. because it really becomes so much more tangible for an organization. The other element here that I think is particularly useful is that what we see from all kinds of technology adoption and what really tends to influence the successful implementation or adoption of a new technology is where companies are doing phased rollouts, where they're able to start with the really core requirements for whatever that technology is and roll it out and build on that success in an iterative approach. Now, what's interesting is if you sort of extend that back into the sales cycle well before you've closed the deal and you start an implementation, the proof of concept itself effectively is the first step of that, right? Because this might be the first real test of whether this is actually going to work in that organization, depending on what type of application it is or what type of software. So proofs of concept, particularly where you have the ability to adapt them for a given customer's needs, are an incredibly powerful part of the sales process. There's another element here, which we'll talk a little bit more about as well, which is, again, going back to this idea that what you set as expectations as you're selling to customers really helps to determine and shape what their expectations are of working with your organization once they do become customers. And a proof of concept can offer a really useful sort of continuity between that pre-sales or sales process experience and that longer term customer experience. So I know, Zvi, you guys did a bunch of research looking at this as well, and you've got some data on how critical things like demos and POCs are to the sales process and in closing deals, right?
Yes, and I think I have some of it in our slides. I'll say in short that, again, people share that, again, more than half of them find the POC is critical. More than 70% are having challenges with that. And let me wave a little bit with my hands again to connect to what you were talking about. We keep looking at sales professionals, right, and executives on a funnel, right? And I think we should all think about, and you talked about this funnel, and for me, right, right now we have some challenges with this funnel, right? Maybe a portion of it is no longer relevant. If you were selling to the hospitality, maybe this portion is disappearing. But I think what we're talking right now, and you explained, Nicole, and we witnessed that as well, is that the technology allows us actually right now to do certain things and expand this funnel right now with a lot of tools. You were used to this one-on-one face-to-face meeting, maybe with some associated cost as we talk about this again. Maybe it's $1,200 per POC or whatever. And right now, the advantage, there is that disadvantage, right? We're unable to meet in person, and that was really helpful for pushing the deal. But by shifting to using technology, you're actually able to open it wide, and you can start a POC again. You mentioned about the change in dialogue, and we see that you're able to start with maybe 1 week and again open it wide. And the second is, can you shorten the sales cycle? Can you really transform your process? And I think the really innovative organization right now are focused on doing that, doing this shift to the way the funnel look, what is relevant, what's no longer relevant, and not worth the effort at this stage.
Well, and it's interesting too, because there's a very strong interplay between, I think, what some of the technology tools enable us to do and the ways that we're working. And I think what we're finding, so if we move on to the next slide, Jeremy, I think this is a good example. What we're finding is that, and I think anybody who has found themselves working from home for the first time and doing it all the time now will tell you that what you did in the office is not the same as what you do now when you're working remotely, right? Just trying to apply the same principles doesn't work out very well. And it means, yes, you're relying on different tools. Jeremy, we were talking about Zoom earlier. That's clearly one of them. But it's also about working in different ways. And it's about kind of understanding what those opportunities are to use some new tools to drive those different ways of working. And one that is a category that we've written about at Constellation is something we've called business acceleration clouds. So really what we're talking about is a kind of platform of platforms that creates a software environment that allows you to easily adapt and virtualize whatever it is that you've created in the software space. And this has particular relevance to what we're talking about here with doing things like live demos or proofs of concept, or even doing things like training environments or development environments, because what you want is to be able to extend that to create almost a kind of virtual reality take, if you will, a virtualization of what that core software is. Now, when we're sitting face to face, we can read body language, we can see what's going on. We talked about the things that we normally used to do in the sales process. What's really fascinating to me is part of what you get with things like Business Acceleration Clouds is the ability to see through the data behaviors that you couldn't necessarily see, even if you were sitting side by side with someone before. So reading body language, definitely helpful. We get some of that when we're doing things like video calls like this one. But what is arguably even more important is getting the kinds of data insights that tell us what real behaviors are actually going on, particularly when we're not there to see them. So part of what is really useful about Business Acceleration Clouds is not only are they elastic and virtual and stateful and really allow us to have more insights, but they are monitoring all kinds of aspects of not only what's going on with the system, but what's happening in terms of usage and user behaviors within that system. And that is a really, really critical source of insight to understand what's happening. So if we move to point 7, which is our last point here, starting as you mean to go on, I want to pause here to talk a little bit about customer success, because I think anyone selling software today probably is working in an organization that has a customer success team. The basis of customer success is to understand and observe and try to influence the factors that promote usage and adoption, because those are the things that ultimately mean the software is successful, right? It's being used, it's doing what it was designed to do, and the people within an organization are actually using it to that end. We understand this pretty clearly when it comes to having already sold something to a customer, right? And I think most organizations understand at this point how critical that is, particularly in a subscription model, to maintaining and building that customer base, right? This is what helps you to ensure that you have happy and successful customers that renew, that increase the scale on which they buy from you, that are extending into other functional areas perhaps. We can apply the same principles in the sales process and with particularly things like proofs of concept. So with the same visibility into the actual behaviors, what's happening within that proof of concept, things like, how much is that POC being used? Were all of the people who were anticipated to be users within the proof of concept actually using it? This gives a tremendous source of insight for you as salespeople to understand what's actually happening within that customer organization and to test your understanding. And I come back again to this idea that it's really all about setting those expectations early in your relationship with customers that might not even be customers yet for what it's going to be like to work with you. And this was my gratuitous opportunity here to put in my reference to the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon, because if you think about it, that's what these guys have done too, right? I mean, there was a lot of skepticism that they would ever be able to land a rocket back on a floating pad out in the middle of the ocean. Well, guess what? They tried it a whole bunch of times and they finally made it work, right? And all of this was done in the expectation that they were ultimately going to do this with actual astronauts in a crew capsule. So every piece of what they worked up to on that launch was, yes, an individual element that had its own goals and priorities, but was ultimately part of a bigger objective as well. And I think if we take that type of mindset when we're approaching customer relationships and we're looking at what tools we use, particularly in software sales, as part of that process, we actually have an opportunity to create a really great feedback loop and to create a sort of level of consistency in customer relationships that we might not have had previously. And that I think is going forward only more and more important to ultimately running a successful business. And with that, those are really the key 7 principles that bring us to the sales kit and how it has changed. a lot of the stuff in the old sales toolkit, I think we hope will come back at some point, right? Travel budget and expense accounts, the things that allow us to get out and see customers, the sponsorships and the conferences that are really an opportunity to meet people, for people to find and meet us, to find out more about what we can do for them, that physical presence, right? We don't have that these days, and we will at some point again, but the things that we do have will still continue to be important even when we have some of those things back. So I think, again, customer research and situational awareness are absolutely crucial, especially in the early stages. And there's a whole wide range of different tools out there. I would argue that even some of the most basic stuff, like looking at, say, an annual report, is a hell of a lot better than doing nothing. But there are some really sophisticated tools that are even using AI to help you understand what kind of market changes might influence what's happening in a business, for example. It doesn't always need to be that level of sophistication. I think the main tool here is asking good questions of your customers. Building virtual connections now. Again, you might not have the luxury of dealing with someone you've met in person, but you can still form a relationship with them. And part of the way you do that is to create some tangible reminders too. Some of those things that they can see and feel and touch that let them know that you are in this with them for real and not in a disingenuous way. And we're in a situation where we don't necessarily have the same ability to read body language, but we can absolutely get hugely valuable insights into the kinds of behaviors that might in some cases even be more important than being able to read body language in a meeting, and the kind of stuff that you can ultimately feed back to your customer or prospect to inform them perhaps about what's going on in their own proof of concept. One thing that doesn't change at all is this idea that personal relationships matter. They have always mattered in sales, and they will always matter for any significant purchase, particularly one that requires a high degree of consideration. So we're finding ways of building and nurturing those personal relationships in the sales process, but they're just as important as ever.
Nicole, maybe I'll add a small thing about the again from our experience, and as you know, again we admire your work on Business Acceleration Cloud, and I think this category is very well representing a lot of the work that we and other vendors are doing in this field. And one example, again, just to give to our audience today, that again, you don't need to be as innovative as SpaceX. Sometimes, again, some of it is really simple to start with, right? Again, just to support the audience, we love innovation, but some of it is really simple. Again, just to give an example, we by doing these POCs online, and we'll get in a minute to describe CloudShare, but doing POCs and engagement online, the data that you mentioned actually able to provide you a level of what's happening right with your prospect. So you're moving from a situation that, wow, this person, we're not meeting in person, and this person didn't answer my email for maybe 4 days, and maybe didn't pick up the phone, but actually inside the POC, they logged in 5 times every day. And I can tell you, wow, that's a very strong indication, right? So it's actually this again, the visibility that you mentioned, and so this is a way to overcome, to provide you a lot of strength of what's happening in this dialogue that you have with the prospect, without getting to the panic. Wow, they didn't answer. It's 4 days. maybe he's too busy with his kids around him. He doesn't want to answer the email or pick the phone. Again, it's a new model, but they're still working on a POC actually, and you're able to get this data and correlate it, and actually get yourself a good confidence that actually the dialogue and is progressing in the right way that you expect.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because I think what's fascinating is that sometimes you can feed that information back to whoever is maybe responsible on the customer side for a proof of concept, things they probably didn't even know about what's going on. And that's actually a useful way of building that connection and confirming that trust with your customer again. I will say, as an analyst, one of the things I have always found fascinating is what people say and what they actually do is often very, very different. So back in the days when I was building market forecasts, for example, what people said they were going to spend money on and what they actually spent money on rarely had a very close correlation. So what's really exciting is when you have the opportunity to look at the actual data coming out of usage and proof of concept, and also, what is the stuff that you're hearing? What are the body language signals that you can read? What are those more anecdotal bits of insight that you have? And you're actually able to build a much, much fuller, more detailed and rich picture of what's happening in that organization with both of those sets of insights. Which I think, Jeremy, brings us to
the end of your chapter. Sure. Thank you,
Yeah,
Nicole,
absolutely.
for that.
And I will say as well, for anybody who's watching this on a recording, who wasn't able to ask questions in real time, if there's anything I can help with, you've got my information here. Don't hesitate to ask. Always happy to have a chat.
And so while we have you for another minute here, do you want to answer Vijay's question on what research tools you would suggest?
There are lots out there. It depends on what kind of business you're in. I'm particularly interested in some of the stuff that's looking at and pulling a lot of publicly available information. So Oracle DataFox, for example, is a really interesting one in my book. They're just one example, but that is a great B2B tool for getting a bunch of context on what's going on with business customers. You don't need to invest in specific tools in many cases. I really am a firm believer that having an inquiring mind and a little bit of time to do some digging will get you pretty far. It is helpful if you also have these, more detailed sources of insight as well. But I think you can get really far down the path of understanding if you can shape some of the right questions to ask. And in fact, I would argue, even if you know a lot or you think you know a lot, use those questions as your primary research tool and ask the customer directly, because for one thing, your assumption might be wrong, but for another, even if it's right, asking them is a demonstration that you are listening to them. And it's a comment Dan Barry made here in the chat that it's about listening better. It's about listening, yes, absolutely, to tone and intonation, but it's also really making sure that you are confirming to your customer that you are listening to them, and you're not just hearing it, you're actually taking that in and doing something with it.
All right, and thanks so much for that, Nicole. And we'll go ahead on to our next speaker, which is Dr. Tzvi Guterman. So why don't you give us a little background on CloudShare and how business acceleration clouds can help the audience out there.
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Nicole. It's wonderful again to collaborate here. A little bit about CloudShare, if you're not familiar. We provide a virtual lab solution for sales enablement and also for additional markets such as training. And our goal is to provide professionals end-to-end solutions that will allow you to do your entire engagement around the hands-on experience. So it starts from a simple demo on your website that you can integrate and drive prospects to a short 15 minutes hands-on experience on your latest and greatest with your product, and up to a 1 month POC or POV, and of course with the real data coming from the prospect and allowing you the interaction, reporting, support of your different resellers, distributors, and so on. And our goal is to allow you and automate as much as we can of the interaction, allowing you to focus, of course, on your business and closing more deals. So that's a short about CloudShare. And again, of course, like Nicole, I'm happy, again, regardless if you are a prospect for us or customer, of course, I'll be happy to address any question during this session or following that. We mentioned, and Nicole was asking earlier, from the hundreds of customers that we have and the research that we're doing as well, and we get a lot of data, and what we learn is that people are more and more dependent on their demos and POCs, and this last 10 weeks, actually, put a lot of pressure to demonstrate it. If you were kind of sometimes ignoring that and saying, okay, yes, I need a demo. I have my laptop. I have my 50 sales engineers, and I have this demo lab, and we have the executive briefing center that people are coming. Now the importance, and especially when we are unable to do these demos, is more and more important. And when it doesn't work well, unfortunately, we have the data, and 50 people are just neglecting the POC, and then of course we lose the deal. And as we know, if we are able just to improve 10% out of that, that's a huge win, and that's our goal. Our goal is to be able to support you, to able to convert more with automation, with the different tools, and allowing technology to allow you to, of course, bring your product in the best way possible.
It goes way beyond avoiding the curse of the live demo, doesn't it?
Yes, of course. We're able to provide you exactly this. Again, we talked earlier with the category you defined as the Business Acceleration Cloud. We are able to give you such data and say, well, you know, the POC, here's the data from the last week. Here's the analytics, here's the business intelligence on the POC in the last week. And this prospect actually engaged. Yes, he engaged 5 people from different offices, from different geographies for a total of 30 hours last week. This is a good engagement for a POC. You're in the right direction. And versus another one that maybe it's 4 days since the last interaction and no one logged in, you should consider, is it going in the right direction? And maybe you want to support. And of course, anything around that, maybe you want to collaborate together with the prospect, we allow you to do that and so on. And I think, Jeremy, we can switch to the next slide. And our goal, again, as I mentioned, is to solve all around it. Again, I'll give a few examples, is to take the real hands-on experience. And maybe this is an important part that I should mention. I assume that for most of our viewer listeners today, it's trivial, but today you run the demo or the POC in the cloud the same way that you would do in your production. So whether you are an on-prem, an enterprise utilizing the cloud, you use Azure, AWS, GCP, your own hosting facility, you want the POC, of course, to be a copy, an identical copy of that. And for us, this is really important to support that. And we do that. We allow you to bring your own data. We allow you to integrate with your legacy system. So if you have a mainframe, and that's part of your evaluation process, we allow you to do that. Networking, all the challenges around it. Again, there's hundreds of features behind the scenes that our goal is to provide that. Of course, when we do that, it's very important for us is to be an independent provider that both the enterprise and the software vendor trust us that we don't do any changes and you really get the hands-on experience and the same way that you would do, again, in your own data center. So while we provide analytics, while we have helped the vendor close more deals, the enterprise must trust us, and we make sure that that's happening, that there's no gains behind the scenes. It's the true evaluation. You're experiencing the product. It's not PowerPoint, right? It's the real product. If you're looking into some feature that you're not sure, you're able to do that, and that's the goal here. And of course, we kept talking all over the last half an hour, engagement, right? Our goal is to allow you to do more engagement, maybe different, right? It's not in person. Usually it works hand in hand with your CRM, with your Zoom or whatever tool that you use for the visual meeting, and we allow you to interact. Just in short about CloudShare, I want to, I think maybe this is my last slide, right, Jeremy? Finish in a short summary, again, connecting, I think, what Nicole and Ray were discussing earlier, that what we witness during this time is we see 3 groups of companies, and one group is actually that was usually not using the cloud before so much. There's someone that used to, and it can be a huge company. It's amazing for us always to find and learn more in the different geography, right? We had just had a $10 billion company from Australia that used to travel a lot, and now it's a big challenge for them. And right now they came and said, wow, let's start and let's really, this is a solution, right? We, as I mentioned, they need to do that very quickly. So that's one group of companies that actually, it's amazing for some of us, but they're utilizing these tools for the first time, right? And they were using cloud for backup, but now they're really considering these capabilities. And this is one group of companies. The other group of companies that we witness is companies that are innovative and shifting the way they think according to the great recommendation that we just talked, shifting their business. Again, changing the way they think about their pipeline. Maybe they're doing now 6-day POC online. Maybe they're using their team remotely, differently in different geographies, and they adapting and doing more. Again, the most innovative, like again, we just watched today earlier in one of my sessions with my team, we have a partner that is doing 3x the number of demos in May compared to their previous usage. 3 times the number of demos, and because they shifted correctly to the way they're doing business. And this is I think, and unfortunately, and we should talk about it definitely here today, there is also companies that are that somewhat in shock mode or are still struggling to understand what they should do, even from our customers, right? They, part of that not working for them, and they still didn't make the shift. And I think as a summary, and what I would encourage here today, I think Nicole gave wonderful ideas, and of course we hopefully provide you a little bit of insights and ideas, and definitely on my end, I'll be happy to talk with each of you, again, regardless if you work with us or not, and provide you more ideas and concrete to your industry. Maybe do you need the 15 minutes demos, or maybe the hours of them, or demos or POCs, and how you work with your channel, and what can you do with certain limitations. We would love to explore and help you again, regardless if you work with us. I think that's it for me. I'll be happy, of course, to address questions. And again, thank you, Nicole and Ray.
Thanks for
Great.
having
Yeah,
us.
we're running, I think, just a little over our time, so I will cut them short, but anyone is welcome to send over an email to Ray, Nicole, or Tzvi at any time, and we'll be happy to answer questions. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. We really appreciate it, and everyone be safe out there and have a great day.